Hi, my name is Kathy Terleski. I want to share with you my progress and findings on a family history project to identify the names of the enslaved persons that lived at Union Hill in Nelson County, Virginia between 1769 and 1865. I began this project in 2020 by reading and transcribing the diaries of my great-great-grandfather, Mayo Cabell. He was the last enslaver at Union Hill and died in 1869. His father and grandfather, who owned the plantation before him, all kept daily journals of business, farm, and family activities and transactions. The journals were kept in Union Hill until the family vacated the home in 1949. At about that time, the journals were given to the Virginia Museum of History and Culture in Richmond, Virginia, which is where I found them. These journals capture the daily activities at the plantation, spanning 4 generations and 100 years from the birth of our country through the end of the Civil War. I have read and transcribed all of these journals to pull out the names of the enslaved at Union Hill. First, a quick introduction on the Cabell family in Virginia. There's a map on the right that has a colored dot representing each Cabell home that was built between 1724 and 1860. There's a zoomable version of this map on the Cabell website at cabell.com. You can see the heart of Cabell country is located on the James River between Richmond and Lynchburg and just south of Charlottesville. Dr. William Cabell, who was born in 1699 in England, emigrated in about 1730 and settled in current Goochland County, Virginia on Licking Hole Creek. He married Elizabeth Burks of New Kent, Virginia, and then patented 4,600 acres further up the James River and moved his family there, settling on Swan Creek and the James River. He named this town Warminster after his boyhood home and built his first home there, Liberty Hall. The Cabell lands were on both sides of the James River in Nelson and Buckingham counties, near the mouth of the Tye River. Over the next 30 years, he continued to acquire and deeded land to his children prior to his death in 1774. The story here is about the legacy of his oldest son, William Cabell Sr. The Union Hill home site is at the site of an old Tuscarora Indian town above the James River. In the 1800s, the neighboring homes were Colleton and Norwood, also owned by the Cabells. You can see from this Google Earth snapshot the proximity to the James River. The low grounds next to the river is where much of the crop farming happened. The James River was used as a highway between Richmond and Lynchburg. The Cabells enslaved people to farm the wheat, corn, and tobacco on the land. Crops were moved from Nelson County to Shockoe in Richmond to be sold. Enslaved labor performed the manual labor associated with running the farm, mills, blacksmiths, boats, and plantation house. There are many outbuildings, including dwellings for enslaved persons, craftsmen, and overseers. The plantations were run as a large village, exchanging resources, including enslaved persons when necessary. In 1780, William Cabell Sr. of Union Hill recorded he had 100 enslaved persons working on his plantation. There was a shared cemetery for the enslaved and their descendants at the Union Hill plantation. None of the homes are still standing today. A new home was built on the Union Hill property around 1990. The Union Hill home was built between 1775 and 1778, with construction interrupted briefly by the Revolutionary War. The photo on the right shows the home as it stood in about 1981. Union Hill was built primarily with materials harvested and engineered locally by the enslaved laborers. Owners to Union Hill were as follows: William Cabell Sr., the oldest son of Dr. William Cabell, who lived in the home from 1778 until his death in 1798. At that time, it passed to his second son, William Cabell Jr., who was called Billy by his father, and in this presentation I will refer to him as Billy to distinguish the Williams. And he lived in the home until his death in 1822. Billy and his wife, Ann Carrington, had 14 children, and their 11th child, Mayo Cabell, took over operations of the home in 1822 when he was only 22 years old. After his mother's death in 1838, he inherited the home. Mayo had 16 children and two of his sons, William Daniel Cabell and Joseph Carrington Cabell Jr., became plantation owners on 2 neighboring plantations after attending college. These plantations were Colleton and Norwood. I will refer to them later in this presentation. Joseph Carrington Cabell only lived briefly at Colleton and was killed in the Civil War. The last occupant was Mayo's unmarried daughter, Lucy Gilmer Cabell, who died there in 1939. The home passed to her younger brother and my great-grandfather, Edward Marshall Cabell. Upon his death in 1946, my grandfather and his sister inherited the home and its contents. This is a home that has been in the same family for 170 years. The two siblings preserved the historical journals and documents, donating them to the repositories in Virginia. There are two cemeteries on the Union Hill property. The Cabell family cemetery is located near the home, and there are about 50 people buried there. The family buried here lived at Union Hill or neighboring plantations, including Colleton and Norwood. There is a slave cemetery down the hill behind the house, just inside the woods. The photo on the top right shows this burial ground. There are many stones scattered about the woods, and some with markings. The Find a Grave online site lists the Union Hill Slave Cemetery and provides 15 names of people buried there. It is believed there are over 150 people buried there, yet very few have legible markers. You can see from the dates here also that the burial ground continued to be used after the end of the Civil War. One goal of this project is to try and find the names of the people who were enslaved at Union Hill and may be buried at this site. One of the reasons I started this project was my interest in genealogy. I could see the challenge for descendants of enslaved persons to find reliable records of their ancestors prior to 1870. The 1870 United States Census, represented by the blue arrow on the right, was the first census recording the full names and ages of all free persons, including previously enslaved persons. Censuses before this date may have enumerated enslaved people but did not provide names and ages. Any genealogy or family information on enslaved ancestors preceding that date is difficult to locate and validate and make universally available. So the availability of so many journals across 4 generations of owners at Union Hill presented an opportunity to capture some of this information and may help families link data in the 1870 census or other records, such as the Freedmen's Bureau records, to their enslaved ancestors who are at Union Hill. The left side of this slide shows the feeder pattern for the slave burial grounds. I knew from reading the journals that the Cabell family members and enslaved persons from Colleton and Norwood were also buried at Union Hill. So these 3 plantations are shown here as the green arrows and the timeline of their owners, the oldest being Colleton and the newest home being Norwood, that was built after William Daniel Cabell graduated from the University of Virginia in 1854. I located, photocopied, and transcribed the journals from these owners and transcribed their wills and their wives' wills to extract the names. This shows the places and dates where names of enslaved persons were found in the journals, from the distribution of clothing lists, tax lists, overseer agreements, and wills. I also transcribed the journal of Mayo Cabell's older sister, Sarah Carrington Cabell, who lived at Union Hill, but it did not include references to enslaved persons' names. A second goal of this project is to generate the list of enslaved people from the journals and hopefully build a bridge to the blue 1870 census arrow. Here are representative pages from the journals of 3 different Cabells. I started transcribing Mayo's journals by taking photos on my phone of each page in the journal and doing the transcription at my desk at home. I went back in time as the handwriting got worse and then pulled them together and read the story from beginning to end. On each page shown here are examples of the types of references to the enslaved persons. On the 20th of January, 1777, William Cabell Sr. records the following. Gave the following Negroes hats, viz. Mingo, Pompey, Yellow Will, Tie River Will, Charles, John, Truslow, Caesar, Roger, and Simeon. Billy's journal for the 2nd of August, 1792, shows the terms of his overseer agreement with Henry Reed. Have employed Henry Reed as an overseer where I lived for the year 1793. The agreement documents the number of shares of corn, wheat, and tobacco that he will be getting and the hands that will be working for him, in addition to 4 workhorses. Mayo's journal on the right shows the records for clothes he gave out in 1851, a list of men and whether or not they got shirts and pants on one side and women on the other side. You can see Albert, Elliot, George, John, Archer, Abram, Jordan, Mayo, Solomon, Anderson, Shedrick, Aaron, Winston, Edmund, Robert, Pat, Moses, Ned, and John Rose. This graph shows the results of the transcription work where the name of enslaved person was written in a journal for a particular year. The x-axis is the year and the y-axis is the unique number of names found in that year. William Cabell Sr. did not provide a comprehensive list of his enslaved persons until the 1790s when he was preparing to divide his property for his children. I pulled out 101 unique persons from these early journals. In the next generation of ownership, there were 42 names that continued in Billy's journals, Billy also provided the most comprehensive list of his enslaved persons in his will of 1822. 71 new names were found. Billy's son Mayo took over operation of the plantation after his father's death under his mother's ownership. In 1838, he became the owner of Union Hill. There are no records I can find of the first 30 years of Mayo's operations of Union Hill. Mayo's journals begin in 1851 to the time he died in 1869. There were 13 names that could be pulled out all the way through from his grandfather's name Enslaved into the 1850s in Mayo's journals. A total of 300 names were found. Here is a summary of my observations of the journal transcriptions. Around 300 names were collected from the journals from 1769 to 1865. Only first names until about 1850. Surnames started to appear, including Hatcher, Trotter, Rose, Bowling, and Banks. I recognized that the names were recorded by free white men, sometimes using adjectives in front of the name that may not have been consistent with what the person was called, such as Tie River Will, Stoop Will, and Yellow Will. I also recognized that the enslaved may have had surnames that were not used or recorded by the enslavers. The number of free and enslaved people were counted by the plantation owner each year as tithables for tax purposes. This included males and females between the ages of 16 and 60. So the names of the young and the very old were not recorded as frequently. Life events like births and deaths for the enslaved persons were sometimes documented. This helped mark a general age for people over time. Mayo appeared to keep families together. He documented his enslaved persons as family unions. The buying and selling of enslaved persons outside of the family was not recorded frequently. There was transfer of enslaved persons between Cabell siblings and Cabell fathers and sons. This is the comprehensive list of all the names extracted from the journals and wills. There are fewer names under William D. Cabell because he and his father appeared to share the workforce. The names under his name are the unique ones only attributable to him. New names that appeared each generation are assumed to be children of the previous generation that reached the age of 16 and could be counted as tithables. There is a possibility that they were required by other means, trade or purchase, but I don't think that is the likely scenario, mainly because the Cabell men recorded every financial transaction made in their journals, and purchasing slaves from others was rarely recorded. Now we can come back full circle to where we started. Have the journals provided any more names of people who were buried in the slave cemetery at Union Hill, or that we can find in the 1870 census? If I go back to the 15 names listed for the cemetery on Find a Grave, I could identify 6 names that might have matches in the journals, but only one confident match of first and last names, and that was Henry Bowling, shown here. We now have more information to call down the names of people potentially buried at Union Hill. I realized while transcribing that the enslavers referred to locations that were not easy to reference, like low grounds, which is most likely the low grounds near the river, but they also referred to, quote, the plantation in Amherst. That being over 10 miles away, it is unlikely the enslaved were brought back to Union Hill for burial. As I continue to document the references for each name, I anticipate the distinction of where they worked may become more apparent. There is a possibility, though, that they were moved between plantations. I did a quick test to see if any of the names in the journals could be linked to the 1870 U.S. Census for Nelson County. I found 7 names after a quick look that are shown here. These names can be directly linked back to the names in the journals. After 3 years of tackling the reading and transcription project, it is nearing completion. If you know of any additional sources that could help build on this information, please reach out to me. To complete the Enslaved Names project, I plan to provide the data in a format that allows the user to verify the information and use it for their own purposes. This includes publishing it in a journal, possibly the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation, and publishing the data on Ancestry.com. We think of Ancestry as the manager of a family tree. However, this data is not in the form of a tree. There may be multiple small family units in this data set and individuals who are not linked to any family. This can be shown on Ancestry as well. I am constructing the tree with linkages by date and events and reference to the enslaver. I'm not sure how this will look on Ancestry, but that is the most common platform today for family research. I'm currently building it in RootsMagic and will upload to Ancestry once complete. I expect that will be in a few months. Lastly, this project has been about a lot more than finding names. It started that way, but it's hard to transcribe without reading every single word very slowly while reading cursive and typing. So what did I learn beyond the names? There was a strong rhythm of plantation life aligned with the seasons: when to plant the trees, the tobacco, and the wheat, when to harvest, when to make brandy and whiskey, and when to go fishing. March and April were big months for fishing in the James River, where they could catch over 1,000 shads in one night. Success for the men was so dependent on the weather. That was at least 50% of what they wrote about in their journals. Every spring they would plant peach trees and say how good they were looking and coming along in April, and then a frost would hit and the peaches would die. But they did like their peach brandy. The story of the ups and downs of farming life repeated throughout each generation. There was hope and despair every year. I observed the relationship between the enslaver and the enslaved over the 4 generations of Cabell men. None would tolerate overseers who were cruel to the enslaved men and women, sometimes firing them on the spot. But the lens they used for cruelness did not encompass the institution of slavery itself. I read of enslaved persons running away, being sold or traded, getting frostbite, and being whipped. I understand better how the Cabell enslavers benefited financially from the practice of slavery, and why nearly 40% of Cabell men between the ages of 15 and 40 years old in Nelson County fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War. I thoroughly enjoyed the labor of transcribing the journals and the final product, and will figure out a way to publish them so you can read them as well. Thank you.